Hello, it's Denise from Women Beyond a Certain Age. Now, I always say I'm excited when I have a guest, but this time I really mean it. It's because it's Miss Nathalie Dupree. I know. Now, I said this to Nathalie off camera, but I mean it. I know that Nathalie is a legend. I know about all the awards that she has won. I know that she's written 14 cookbooks, and I know she is considered the Queen of Southern Cooking. But here's really what I think. Nathalie, I met several years ago, and she's just a dear friend to me. And that's what I think of Nathalie Dupree. She is one of the best girlfriends you can ever have in life. So hello, Miss Nathalie, welcome.
Hello, I thought you were my sister.
I know. Nathalie calls me sis. Not everybody knows that. She calls me sis, which I absolutely love.
We both lived wild lives in our youth. And now we are calm and serene and over a certain age.
I wasn't going to get to that this first thing, but I'll tell you this, that people need to know one thing. And then we're going to talk about, Nathalie, how you got from being in high school in New Jersey to being the Queen of Southern Cooking.
Oh, no, I wasn't in high school in New Jersey.
Where were you?
I was in high school in Virginia. I grew up in Virginia.
Oh, excuse me. Now that makes more sense. Now, I don't know why I thought you were in New Jersey in high school.
Somewhere it was important to say that I was born in New Jersey. Because that is where I was born. But, there was a war on or about to be, and my father was in the Army. And so I was born on an Army base, but then we moved again.
Now, I need to tell people, Nathalie, because I'm going to refer to it, your latest book. I have several of Nathalie's books, and Nathalie's written 14 cookbooks, and people go to Amazon and you'll, if in case you don't know Nathalie's cookbooks, but Nathalie, your favorite stories and recipes, which is new, I have read from cover to cover. We are going to give a copy away to people. We'll have a drawing after your episode comes up. And honey, the stories are magnificent. They're magnificent.
Thank you.
They're just, they warm my heart. Well, here I am reading a fabulous story from Nathalie Dupree's new book, Favorite Stories and Recipes. The story is entitled A Special Family Breakfast. They'd been divorced nearly 40 years when my father phoned me, asking me to help him see his former wife, my mother, together with the rest of their children. His second wife and her second husband were now dead, and each of my parents was alone. Surprisingly, my mother agreed to the meeting for the sake of the children. Her rancor at being left with 3 demanding children had cooled in the slow oven of time, and now it rarely flared and only sizzled. He had suggested they have breakfast, his favorite meal, at his local diner. He was now 82 and rose before dawn, finishing eating before the sun was up. On those rare occasions when he waited until 7 or 8 in the morning, it was a grave concession to the rest of the world's rhythm. My mother, now 75, still worked 3 days a week for the church library. In her heart of hearts, she thought the world would be a better place if everyone slept a bit later, at least until dawn, ate breakfast after sunrise, and came gently into the world each morning, only after reading and praying. I knew that diner only too well, for that is where I met him many times at barbaric hours of the morning for grits and eggs and bacon. They served cheap margarine, and the waitresses parceled out the sugar and sweet and low packets from their apron pockets only upon request. There was always a crowd there, always a din, with salesmen calling to each other across the red vinyl booths. What kind of meal, what kind of place should it be for all the family to meet 40 years later? Surely a place where they wouldn't have to shout, because if they started to shout only to be heard, maybe it would continue, their voices rising distinct over the cacophony, spiraling above them all with the stifled angers of bygone years. No, it had to be a place where the atmosphere would temper those feelings if the pot was uncovered. It had to be at an hour when the crowds were sparse, when the world had already moved into its daily rhythm. The place had to serve butter. The bread had to be warm. We children, grown, terrified of the event, had to be able to leave without bolting if the pain became too great. But what if they all left? Who would pay the check in the swirl of emotions? It was agreed we would all get together at a small, elegant hotel at 9 in the morning. We met in the gilded lobby and proceeded to the dining room, where mercifully we were greeted expeditiously and seated in the rear of the room. He ordered the same breakfast he always had nearly every day of his life. Mother was swept up by the occasion, the splendor of the room, the length of the menu. She vacillated, unsure of what would be the best, wanting to remember the best. We children ordered the safest items, no crumbled croissants for them. Breakfast came. The bread was hot, the butter was real, it melted easily. It was to me terrifying to find we were civilized, polite, and liked each other. Do you miss your husband? He asked. Yes, she said. He was good to me, and we had the church. She paused, then asked shyly, do you miss your wife? Yes, he answered, although she wasn't herself for a long time. Your husband wasn't either, was he? No, she said. He didn't know me for some time. They looked at each other from lowered eyes. We children faded, shadowed, and didn't know the people our parents had become in just a few moments. He said to her at last, I see you still drink too much coffee. She said yes, and laughed a small, delicate bell-like laugh her children had never heard before. It even surprised her. As she raised her hand to cover her mouth, her napkin fell to the carpet. I only drink 1 cup a day, he said, and stooped to retrieve her napkin. You still have the most beautiful legs of any woman I have known, he remarked, wiping the drops of his single cup of coffee from his smile. I've always liked your mustache, she returned, watching as his napkin left the mouth she used to know. Everyone started talking at once, sharing memories, laughing and teasing, the pot of emotions now bubbling like a good soup. We took pictures. He called the waiter over. He was always more comfortable with strangers than intimates. This is my family, he said. These are my children. This is their mother, and this is the first time we've all been together in 40 years. The waiter smiled politely and took more pictures for us. You did a good job with the children, my father said. Turning to us children, she said, God helped me. They are my jewels. He called for the check and said, next time let's go to my favorite diner. A bit earlier. I can't afford this expensive restaurant again. She smiled and nodded her head as he took her arm and walked her to the car, we children only moments behind, dazed with the wonder of it all. We were a family. Maybe we always had been. I wasn't going to say it yet, but people don't know Natalie, and I won't tell you any of it, even after one of us dies. No one's going to know that you and I text each other some of our sordid past stories. We could probably sell them, girl, but
probably
they're going to the grave with us.
Well, I'd rather be a nice nin and live forever in people's mind, but I don't think that'll happen.
Oh, well.
I can't find a rich old man to pay me.
You've done all right. You've done all right. I need to know, Natalie, how you found cooking.
How I found cooking. I always liked to cook at home.
Okay.
But during that age, of course, first I grew up during ration, which people may not realize that we did in the United States. And I was thinking about it this morning. I mean, when I grew up, when I was a little, they rationed butter, and that's how come there was margarine. We used to make great scenes about having to eat margarine, my sister and I. And sugar was rationed. There was, so that was until I was 5 or 6, I guess. And then I liked to cook, but my mother had to shop on the bus. So things were limited.
Yes.
So it was only when I got out from home that I discovered a sort of a passion for it. And that was when, after my sophomore year, I moved to Boston, to go to Harvard summer school, to meet a Harvard boy.
Well,
probably.
A very smart plan, a smart plan.
Probably. And I lived in an international student house, and I wound up being the cook for 2 weeks. The cook was sick, was in the hospital.
Okay.
And I made tons of mistakes, but I loved it.
Nathalie, the reason why I totally applaud that you went to Harvard summer school and potentially might have met a lovely man was because I only went to nursing school. I only applied to nursing school because I thought I could marry a doctor.
How did that work out?
Well, that was my first husband, and he wasn't a doctor, and it was a dentist. And actually, it didn't work out that well. And I had no gift for nursing, as we say. And my mother kept saying, Denise, this is not your career. You just think you'll look good in the uniform. So that we learned that. So you started cooking for what? The other students that were there?
Yes, I was living in an international student house, and the cook had to get an operation. And because I had defaulted on my other duties, I was assigned to be the cook, and I loved it. We paid $15 a month. I think it was 5 nights, Monday through Friday. So I would have about 18 of us. It was 15 of one and 18 of the other. I don't know which is which. But anyway, I made all my mistakes and still could turn out a meal.
I love that.
And it was the most glorious feeling, to be able to turn out a meal for all those people, even when I was making mistakes. It was just fabulous. I mean, I multiplied things by 3, for instance, my first night. So I have advice for everyone. You never want to multiply anything by 3. At most, you want to double it and then double it again. But first, nobody can do 1/3 fractions.
No,
you don't know what 3/8 of a teaspoon is, right? I mean, yeah.
No, we don't.
So anyway, 9/8 of a teaspoon, I guess you could do that if you were really smart. But anyway, and also in multiplying it by 3, you get 3 times as much grease. So if you only need a certain amount of fat to saute onions, you don't need a lot more. You don't need 3 times as much. So between my math and my multiplying of fats and so forth, I wound up with a layer of grease and then this gloppy white stuff that was probably flour and milk or whatever. And I realized that when you multiply a recipe, you have to give the recipe, because it'll say stir 3 minutes or whatever. Well, if you stir 3 times as much, then, but you don't stir but 3 minutes, it's not going to thicken. Well, if you don't know why you're stirring it, if someone just says stir 3 minutes, then you wind up with what I wound up with, floppy. And then, so then that was on top of the tuna fish, and then, heavier things sink. So I didn't know what to do, but I stirred it all together, and I quickly made some toast in the oven, which I could do, and I served it over toast, and I added green peas from the freezer, or from a can probably, and I called it tuna fish a la king.
I was just going to say, Miss Nathalie, that is tuna a la king. I love it.
That's a real rule of mine. You don't ever tell anybody what you're serving until you have to, because you never know what's going to happen in the kitchen. And if you have guests and you're not a professional cook, you don't have any obligation to say what they're gonna eat. They have an obligation to tell you what they're allergic to, and that's it.
Nathalie, I totally agree. Of course, having been in catering for many, many years, things go south, as we used to say.
That's right.
Or things happen. And I once had an expensive party, Miss Nathalie. And what no one told me that when all these cakes got delivered from the bakery, that one was a frozen white chocolate mousse case and it needed to go in the freezer. So it was thawing out until I noticed this white goo all over the kitchen floor. It was the man who was paying for the party's favorite cake. I picked up, wasn't on the floor, and I threw that unfrozen muck in the champagne glass and served it to him. And he kept saying, "Oh, I love this presentation. No one's ever given me this cake like this before."
Yes.
And that I'm the same with you. Walk proudly and serve what you made. That's what you got to do.
Right. Right.
Where did you cook after that?
Then I didn't cook.
Oh, okay.
I just cooked at home or whatever. But I didn't, I called my mother and told her that I loved it and I wanted to be a cook. And she said I'd have to work at night with men lifting heavy pots. Yeah. And that they would be hard to work with and difficult, and they wouldn't treat me with respect, and that she had always hoped that I would be a lady, and that ladies didn't cook.
Yeah.
And if I could find anyone cooking that wasn't cooking in a diner, a lady, or, slinging hash somewhere, that I would have her blessing, but otherwise not. And, I could find a lady that was a cook then. I couldn't find anyone that was educated, that was a woman that was cooking, because it just wasn't done. Maybe someone had their own restaurant, but they were probably French somewhere. I probably didn't look up all French names. So I didn't cook. I had 100 different jobs easily. I was secretary. I was a Girl Friday. I was a copywriter. I was a research assistant. I did research on cancer. Well, I just had a lot of jobs, none of which I did very well. But I could always get hired because I had a good gift of gab, but, yes. I didn't necessarily keep them that well because I'm not good at the things that you have to be a little helper, like a secretary. I'm not good at filing. I'm not good at typing without mistakes, those things.
I understand.
We were supposed to be secretaries, teachers, or nurses, Denise.
Yes, that's right. No, Nathalie, it hadn't changed that much. We have a decade between us, but I have to tell you, my choices were very much until Gloria Steinem said, "You can go to law school." Same thing. My father and mother assumed I would be a nurse or a teacher. Do you know what I mean?
That's right.
Or a secretary. And then the 70s came and women said, I can be, I can be a lawyer, I can be a doctor. And it was mind blowing to me because yes. I had not been raised that way. I had not been raised.
No, there might have been a few, but we weren't even allowed to see them. In South Carolina and Georgia, I think women couldn't practice law, weren't even allowed in the courtroom until I was a grown woman.
For God's sakes, of course.
So
I hear you.
It never occurred to me when cooking was out, I didn't know what else to do. So then I married my favorite former husband, and we moved to London. And while I was there, I stumbled into the Cordon Bleu at the recommendation of a girl that I met while I was looking for a house, who I still talk to on Facebook. And after one lesson, a demonstration, where they made puff pastry wrapped around a lamb chop with a sauce chasseur, which was a homemade brown stock and sauce. Right. went home and invited people for dinner and proceeded to make puff pastry wrapped around a lamb chop with the sauce chasseur in my tiny service flat where we were living while we were looking for a place to live. So I was a failure. I was so mad. I mean, we ate lamb chops, so that was fine. But I was sad that I couldn't do the rest of it, that I went back the next day and signed up. I didn't want to be a lady. I mean, I just didn't care. I wanted to learn how to do that. I was that passionate.
I love it.
So it was always my mistakes that led me to what I wanted to do.
Nathalie, I'm going to repeat that because that's something it was my mistakes that always led me to what I was supposed to do. See, I think that is brilliant, and it's not what we're taught. Do you know what I mean?
No.
We're not taught that. And I feel the same way. I have failed so many times, Nathalie. I mean, big time failure.
Right.
And you know what? That was the only time I learned. That's when I would shake myself off and stand up and think, oh, okay, I'll go in another direction.
Right.
Bless you.
Right.
It's a huge statement, Miss Nathalie.
Yeah.
So in the Cordon Bleu, did you become a star student?
No, I certainly was not a star student. I was so anxious. I mean, I cared so much. I remember that the day that we were supposed to make orange marmalade, I was just plain terrified. I had myself a nervous wreck, and I stopped and I went over to see a friend some ungodly hour, like 8:30 in the morning, an older woman friend, and just walked into her flat crying because I was so terrified of making orange marmalade. You know, so no, I wasn't. As it was, marmalade turned out fine. It was all new to me. I mean, this whole thing that sauces had names and techniques and all of that. And that's when I realized, you know, that the things that I did know how to do did have techniques, like the tuna fish casserole, you know, that there was a technique behind it, even if the newspaper article didn't say that you were stirring to make it the flour cook. So gotcha. I was terrified, and I wasn't the star student. I think that was a girl from Scotland that was very prim and very tidy and very always looked wonderful. She always had her hat on right and her scarf tied right, and her shirt was always clean. But towards the end, it came time to do puff pastry. And I said, don't you want to make it? And she said, oh, no, she said, I haven't made any puff pastry. And I said, what, you've been here the whole time and you haven't made puff pastry? And she said, well, no, I didn't want to, you know, make a mess of it. So the reason that she was the star student was because she hadn't made any mistakes. Well, bless her heart, then she hadn't learned anything.
I love that, Nathalie. You know what, Nathalie, I so understand that too. Do you know what I mean? People that don't want to make mistakes. I've made so many in my life, I gave up worrying about that, you know, a long time ago.
That's right.
And I really did. And also, I was raised by people, my parents, wonderful, wonderful people, but my father would point out mistakes. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
And with that, I had two older sisters. I saw that he wasn't always right. Do you know what I mean? Though,
yes.
You know. So as the youngest, you have a different view.
Right.
And I remember thinking, okay, so I made a mistake, big deal, no one died, I'll get over it. And I've kind of lived that way the rest of my life.
Right. Well, it's a big shock to learn that all men are not perfect.
Ain't it though?
And that's true in the kitchen too.
That's right.
Chefs don't always know everything either. As we find out, I mean, as the rules change all the time, where all of a sudden now parsley is a salad.
I,
You know, the way of seasoning, somebody was questioning why we always had to use salt and pepper the other day. Why don't we just give up pepper as a seasoning? I mean, I don't remember who it was or where I read it, but people are questioning things all the time. So these techniques do change.
But I have to tell you, I read the article about pepper and I thought, what are you talking about? I love black pepper in food. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, I love the sharp taste of it. I mean, I want black pepper in my food.
Right.
When I read that article, I kind of thought, okay, never mind. And I just moved on.
Yes.
Because, yeah, there are a lot of changes, but you certainly don't have to adapt to all of them, depending on who you are.
That's right. Well, I thought that article was probably written by a man. And so I just ignored it too.
I thought it was probably written by someone who'd gotten a job assignment from their editor that was supposed to write something different. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And that's what they came up with. So after the Cordon Bleu, where did you go?
Well, we went to Spain to wait out the tax year. And we went to Majorca where we had friends. And I was in a swimming pool about 3 days after I got my degree. And someone came up to me and said that there was a restaurant in the middle of the island. They were desperate for a chef. So two Jews in New York were interviewing me in my bathing suit to run this restaurant that they owned in Formentor, Majorca. And so, not Formentor, Poyensa, Majorca. And so I somehow or other accepted. And then the next day, I showed up to be the chef of this restaurant.
And here I am reading another story, Mussel Memory. Tonight, as I scrub mussels for dinner, removing their beards and carefully lifting them from the water so the sand is left in the sink, I remember the time when I became chef of Cipolletti, a small country restaurant between Alcudia and Pollença in Majorca, Spain. I had more courage than knowledge. Having just received my advanced certificate from the London Cordon Bleu, I had never worked in a restaurant before and didn't really know what I didn't know. In fact, many years before, I'd been convinced by my mother and friends that ladies didn't work in restaurants, so I had given up the idea. Then one night, I asked the owner of a restaurant in Palma, where we were living for a few months, if I could hang around in the kitchen and observe for a few nights. She agreed. And in the way that life has, the next day I was offered a job in the country, an hour from Palma, at what was reputed to be the best restaurant on the island. The French chef had quit because there were no women for him to date there, and the female New York owners were desperate enough to hire an inexperienced young woman as chef. The deal was all diners were to be by reservation only, so the kitchen could accommodate my pace, which was bound to be slower than the French chefs. But as it happens in so many restaurants, the desire for exclusivity, good food and service was overcome by greed, and the maitre d' took all comers, reservations or no. Mussels were on the menu the first night. When I was attending school in England, I had scrubbed and cooked up many a batch of mussels for crowds of friends, so I felt confident. Of course, those mussels had come from the market. These mussels had come directly from the ocean, but I figured they were the same. I hadn't reckoned on the Majorcan yellow jackets and hornets. I had assumed the windows of the kitchen were screened. After all, it's been hot there every summer for centuries. I was wrong. There were no screens anywhere, but there were venomous flying insects, and they liked me. They liked me a lot. 7 bites in 10 minutes worth just before we started serving. With tears streaming down my cheeks from bites, from frustration, from the fear of being the chef of a restaurant, I put the mussels on to cook. First, I had put them in a big sink in the middle of the kitchen, covered them with ocean water, and scattered them over an oatmeal-type product to feed and plump them up before serving. The little Spanish maids who were my helpers had scrubbed them, removing their beards, and put them in the pan back in the sink in ocean water. I heated a pan and added the mussels, still crying. I added salt and pepper. When their shiny black shells opened to show the sensuous flesh of the mussels inside, I sent them to the table where the proud owners sat, awaiting their first meal by their new chef. Moments later, the two ladies who owned the restaurant stormed into the kitchen. It didn't take long to find out the source of their wrath. Unthinkingly, I had added salt to the water, then sent the mussels to the table without tasting their broth. The broth was so salty, the owner said, a spoon would have stood up in it. I personally think they were exaggerating. Still, it was salty enough to be nearly inedible. I began crying in earnest now, my first job in a kitchen, and I had blown it, partly due to the flying creatures, and partly because I had forgotten all the things I'd ever learned, and most importantly, to taste, taste, taste. The owners left the kitchen. After all, they couldn't fire me in the middle of the meal. And so we started a rocky relationship, which lasted until the season ended and our contract was up. They never did fire me, and I didn't quit. And I never again salted mussels until I was quite sure the broth needed flavoring. But I don't think they ever hired a novice cook again. So, Miss Nathalie, you're in the swimming pool 3 days after you graduate from school in Spain. Did you speak Spanish? Did you speak?
No, because I barely squeaked by French and Spanish because I knew I would never need them.
Now, so you take the job. And I love this, Nathalie. Now, this is again, now I see this is a pattern sometimes with we see in women beyond a certain age's stories. The fact that you were frightened, you continued to do something. Do you know what I mean? You obviously loved it enough that your passion, you said, sure, I'll be the chef at a restaurant that you probably weren't qualified for at the time, but never mind. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Well, I didn't know what I didn't know.
That's right.
And in a way, thank God.
That's right.
When I do know, I'm afraid to try for things, but I didn't know that. I knew I hadn't ever been in a restaurant kitchen before. So the night before I started, I asked a woman who owned a restaurant, but was running the front of the house, if I could stand in the kitchen and watch her chef.
Excellent.
And that's when I found out you could reheat chicken.
I want to remind people that your latest book, called Favorite Stories and Recipes, is without a doubt. See, Nathalie, I don't think that people often know that cookbook writers can also be just plain old writers, wonderful writers, and that's what you are. So it's absolutely lovely to read your new book. And on our website, we archive all of the podcasts, and we have a Facebook page that after this goes up, people want to ask you questions, Miss Nathalie, they will, and they can reach out to you.
Oh, good.
So, yeah. Oh, no, it's wonderful because we've barely scratched the surface in your career.
That's right.
I know it. I do want to tell people that Nathalie and I met because of IACP, which I've talked about a lot, Nathalie, in these podcasts, and that the network of the people that are in food that I've made have made a huge difference in my career.
Yes, women, network.
All righty. Thank you, Miss Nathalie. We'll talk to you again.
Bye.
Bye.